Always Investigating with Audrey and Isaac is your go-to podcast for all things mysterious and fascinating. Join Audrey and Isaac as they dive into the world's most intriguing enigmas, unsolved mysteries, and bizarre phenomena. No stone is left unturned in their quest for answers, bringing you insights, laughter, and maybe even a few chills. Tune in and join the adventure, because mysteries are everywhere, just waiting to be uncovered.
All right, so get ready, because today we're diving into the world of Bigfoot. And, it's way more than just a monster movie thing.
Right.
This legend goes way back and has deep roots, especially in Native American history.
Oh, absolutely. Even before Bigfoot, became a household name, indigenous cultures already had names like Simekwes and Skookums for this creature. These names were woven into their traditions for centuries.
Really?
Yeah, they weren't just stories around a campfire or anything. They were a real part of their history passed down through generations.
Wow. See, that's what always gets me about Bigfoot. It's not just like one region or anything. These stories, they're everywhere, right? Different tribes, different landscapes all across North America, but always this core idea of like this large, mysterious figure hiding out there.
Yeah, and it's that consistency that really makes you think. When you have all these separate groups of people with similar stories like that, it makes you wonder if there isn't something real behind it all,
I know. It's like, what are the chances? Right.
Right.
Okay, so we've got all this folklore as like a backdrop. But then things get really interesting in the 1950s. We're not just talking about old stories anymore. We're talking about those massive footprints found in Bluff Creek, California, 16 inches. That's when Bigfoot, as we know him today, was really born.
Bluff Creek was definitely a turning point. That's where those old stories kind of collided with our modern fascination.
Oh, really?
And even though those footprints turned out to be a prank, they created this image of Bigfoot in everyone's mind. It's like he stepped out of the shadows and right onto the front page.
He went viral before going viral was a thing.
Ex-
Okay, so speaking of how we picture Bigfoot, when we say Bigfoot, what are we actually talking about? Like, what does he look like? I figure there's got to be some variation in the descriptions, right?
Oh, for sure. There are definitely variations. But what's interesting is that there's also this surprisingly consistent image that emerges.
Yeah.
Like most people describe Bigfoot as being somewhere between 6 and 10 feet tall, covered in dark hair and very muscular. But here's the thing. Lots of people say he moves really smoothly, almost like a human, which is pretty crazy when you think about how big he's supposed to be.
Right. You'd think he would move like a bear or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But people always say there's something different about the way
Okay.
he moves.
It's like they're saying he's not just big. He's like comfortable out there. Like
Yeah.
he really belongs.
Yeah. It's almost like he's more at home in the wilderness than we are.
Okay, so we've got these sightings, but what about the Patterson-Gimlin film? That grainy footage from 1967 is like the holy grail of Bigfoot evidence, or is it?
Right. And it's still sparking debates today.
I know. But you know what gets me? That footage has never been totally debunked.
That's what makes it so fascinating. Even with all the technology we have now, people are still arguing about it. Some people say it's just a guy in a suit. But then others are like, how could they even make a suit that moves like that back then?
Right. Like special effects were not what they are today.
Exactly. It really makes you think about what they captured on that film.
Okay, so we've talked about sightings, we've talked about that footage, but you can't talk about Bigfoot without talking about footprints, right? It's like his calling card.
It's true. Footprints are a huge part of the Bigfoot story. And for a lot of people, finding one would be like the ultimate proof.
Oh, for sure. It would be amazing.
But we also have to be realistic. Footprints are pretty easy to fake. And unfortunately, some of the most famous Bigfoot prints, like the ones made by Ray Wallace, turned out to be hoaxes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there have been hoaxes. But are there any unexplained prints, like ones that even the skeptics can't explain away?
There are, actually. We're talking about tracks found way out in the middle of nowhere, miles from any trails. And get this, some of them even have these super detailed markings called dermal ridges. It would be almost impossible to fake that kind of detail.
Dermal ridges, that's like fingerprints.
Exactly. And it makes those footprints a lot harder to dismiss.
Okay, so we've got possible sightings, weird footprints, but what about sounds? Are there any recordings that suggest Bigfoot is trying to communicate? I've heard about those eerie howls and even something called samurai chatter. Is that a real thing?
It is. People who've heard it say it sounds like a bunch of different vocalizations, almost like a language. But we haven't been able to figure out what it means.
It's like we're trying to crack a code, but we don't even know what language it's in.
Exactly. And then you have those recordings, like the Sierra sounds from the 1970s. They're full of whoops, knocks, and calls that some experts say don't match any known animals in those areas.
Okay, now those recordings really make you wonder. Have experts been able to figure out what's making those strange sounds, or are they still scratching their heads? It's like trying to listen to a conversation in a language you've never even heard of. But speaking of mysteries, let's talk about the hunt for physical evidence. You'd think with all the technology we have now, there'd be some concrete proof by now, right? Like DNA or something?
Right. It seems like we should have something by now.
Yeah, like a strand of hair or something.
Yeah. Well, there have been a lot of claims over the years, and people find things all the time, hair samples, things like that.
Right.
But most of the time, it turns out to be from a bear or a deer. Even like dogs have tripped people up.
Really?
Yeah. You'd be surprised how much those common animals end up confusing the search for Bigfoot DNA.
Wow. So it's not as simple as just finding something and running it through a DNA test. But what about that study a while back that claimed to have found Bigfoot DNA? Wasn't that a big deal?
Oh, you mean Dr. Ketchum's research?
Yeah, that was the one.
That definitely got people talking. Her team said they found evidence of a hybrid species, like maybe even with connections to ancient humans.
Like an ancestor we haven't discovered yet?
Something like that. It's a really wild idea. Basically, they were suggesting Bigfoot might not be a totally unknown primate, but like a mix of different species.
That would make it even harder to find a DNA match. But didn't that study have some problems? I remember hearing some scientists weren't too happy with it.
Yeah, there are definitely some criticisms. The biggest one was that the methods they used weren't as strong as they should have been for such a big claim.
So like the science wasn't totally solid.
Right. And there were also worries about contamination, which is a big deal with this kind of research. Like we were saying before, it's so easy to get mixed up with other animals.
It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, but the haystack is full of other needles that look almost exactly the same. But okay, so let's say Bigfoot is real. Where could something that big actually be hiding? You'd think we would have stumbled across it by now.
Well, you have to think about the places where these sightings happen. We're talking about massive areas with dense forests and rugged mountains. The Pacific Northwest is a good example. There's so much space and so much dense wilderness out there. It wouldn't be that hard for something to stay hidden if it wanted to.
Especially if it's smart and knows how to avoid people.
Exactly.
It's like that saying, you can't see the forest for the trees. Or in this case, maybe you can't see the Bigfoot for the forest.
Uh-huh.
Maybe that's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we've got to be fair to the skeptics here.
Yeah.
They make some good points too, right? Like the biggest one being that we just don't have that one undeniable piece of evidence.
Yeah, that's definitely a big hurdle for a lot of people. We've been looking for decades, and we haven't found a skeleton or a clear photo or a DNA sample that everyone agrees on. That makes you wonder. It does. I mean, if a creature like that was really out there, wouldn't there be more to go on by now? And haven't there been times when people thought they saw a Bigfoot, but it turned out to be something else?
Oh yeah, all the time. That's where things like pareidolia come in.
Pareidolia. What's that?
So it's this thing our brains do where we see patterns even when they're not really there. Like when you see a face in a cloud or a shape in the shadows, it's the same thing that makes people see Bigfoot when really it's just a bear or even just some weird shadows.
So our brains are basically playing tricks on us.
Kinda. And it makes sense if you think about it. We're always looking for patterns, and our brains are wired to see familiar things.
Yeah.
So if someone's out in the woods and they catch a glimpse of something big and dark, it's easy to jump to Bigfoot, especially if they already believe in it.
Especially if they've listened to one too many Bigfoot podcasts.
Exactly. But it's not just about what we see. It's also about how stories change over time. Think about it. Someone might see something a little strange in the woods. They tell their friends, and then those friends tell other friends. And with each retelling, the story can get a little more exaggerated, a little more exciting.
Like a game of telephone, but with Bigfoot.
Right. So what started as a brief glimpse of something might turn into a full-blown Bigfoot encounter by the time the story's been passed around a few times.
That's wild. So basically, we've got the skeptics saying it's all in our heads, misidentifications, tall tales, and our own imaginations running wild. But then we have all these intriguing clues and those stories that just won't go away. It's a real head scratcher. It's like we're trying to decide between what we can explain and what might be unexplainable. So where do you land on all this after everything we've talked about? Is there a part of you that kind of wants to believe, even if we never have all the answers?
I mean, who doesn't love a good mystery, right?
Mm.
There's something really captivating about the idea that there could be this big, intelligent creature out there that we haven't totally figured out,
Yeah,
especially in a world where it feels like we've already discovered everything.
it's true. Like we're always looking for those last unexplored corners of the map. And Bigfoot represents that kind of wildness, that sense of mystery that we don't get to experience that often anymore. Yeah.
Exactly. It's like he reminds us that there are still things out there that we don't understand.
But hey, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's not about actually finding Bigfoot. Maybe it's about the search itself.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Just think about all the discoveries we've made because of people looking for him. Researchers have found new species of plants and animals. They've mapped out huge areas of wilderness that we didn't know much about before.
And they probably wouldn't have even been there if it weren't for Bigfoot. It's like he's this accidental ambassador for exploration.
Absolutely. He's got people out there looking at the world in a different way.
Plus, you can't deny the impact Bigfoot has had on our culture. I mean, you've got whole groups dedicated to finding him. You've got festivals and events, and don't even get me started on Bigfoot tourism.
It's true. He's become a cultural icon. Whether you believe in him or not, you can't deny that he's captured our imagination.
Totally. And who knows, maybe someday someone will find that one missing piece of the puzzle, that undeniable proof. Wouldn't that be something?
Can you imagine? That would be huge.
It makes you wonder, though, would that ruin it? If we finally had all the answers, would it take away from the mystery? Or would it just make it even more real?
That's a really interesting question. It's like we're drawn to the unknown, but then we also want answers.
Maybe it's about finding that balance between those two things. The excitement of not knowing and the satisfaction of figuring things out. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it for today. This deep dive has been full of twists and turns, but I think one thing is clear. We might never have all the answers when it comes to Bigfoot, but the search itself can teach us a lot about our world and maybe even about ourselves.
That's beautifully said. I couldn't agree more.
Well, thank you. And to everyone listening, thanks for coming along on this journey with us. Keep exploring, keep your curiosity alive, and hey, you never know what you might find out there. Until next time, happy adventuring.